of the Science, Medicine, and Technology Subcommittee at HASP. And it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Greg Murray for the second session of his course on the biological consequences of climate change. Greg is the T. Elliott Weir Professor of Plant Science in the Department of Biology at Hope. Greg grew up in Southern California and earned his BA and MS degrees in biology at California State University, Northridge. He received his PhD in zoology from the University of Florida and joined the biology faculty at Hope College in 1986. So, Greg, welcome, and looking forward to hearing more insightful comments in this second session, and I'll turn it over to you.
Sorry, I was muted there, and something on my screen switched. I'm going to go into sharing my screen now, and it'll take me just a second to get this correct and be able to see all of you at the same time. So I think that if I swap this, now you should be able to see my presentation. I'm working again from as I was last week from two monitors. I want to make two apologies to start out with. One, I see that there's a lot of reflection off of my glasses, and so, you know, you guys of all people will understand why I'm constantly doing this with the reading glasses, but I don't have to. I wear contact lenses, but they're not enough to correct my vision. I still need the cheap reading glasses too. The second one is there will be probably some overlap between what I talk about today and what I spoke about a couple of nights ago at an event for living sustainably along the lakeshore, and that was about climate change and Holland's response to it. I would urge all of you who are interested in this issue and what Holland is doing to combat and adapt to climate change to get involved in that too. And there are a bunch of ways of doing that. There are lots of local groups that work on it. And somebody can say, somebody like Peter Bugard could say something about that, or Don Triesenberg, if they're in this call, and I think they are. Anyway, I want to pick up where we left off last time. Last time, I think we had been talking about the geographic range changes that would be required for a lot of species to survive under the scenarios of climate change that are predicted. Recall that this one was for sugar maple under the current climate that predicted for that also predicted for the conditions that would occur under one of the scenarios of climate change where we don't cut our carbon emissions very fast. And of course, we're expecting the geographic range to shift northward. And there are lots and lots of cases like that. These are the results of those bioclimatic envelope models. We also talked right about at the time we were ending, we were talking about the effect that habitat fragmentation has on species' ability to move along with the changing climate, to stay in the conditions that they're physiologically adapted to. Recall that the magnitude of temperature change is projected to be greatest at high latitudes and lower at lower latitudes, that is in the tropics. So we're expecting the magnitude of temperature change to be highest towards the poles and lower in the areas that are already warmer for the reasons that we talked about last time. I think I ended with this slide on the recent history of sea level rise, and we'll come back to some of the likely impacts of that a little bit later. but this transitions into something that I want to say about those geographic range changes in some different ways too. We've all seen photos like this, which highlight the threat of climate change to, for what for many of us is an iconic species that only occurs at high latitudes, where the predicted temperature increases are projected at about 6 degrees Fahrenheit over the 1981 to 2005 baseline by the middle of this century. That's only 30 years away. And these sorts of pictures are sort of shown to suggest what some of the effects might be on that species as sea ice decreases. Of course, the foraging behavior of polar bears depends on sea ice. What I want to do next is to show the results of some of that same kind of bioclimatic envelope modeling that we talked about last time, but over larger spatial scales, and point out some patterns that didn't originally occur to people who concluded that the biological effects of climate change would logically be most severe where the temperature changes were the greatest, that is at high latitudes. This is from a publication from a few years back, and this is the result of bioclimatic envelope modeling for the world's amphibians, birds, and mammals. And what's shown here is the percent change, and here's the color scale here, the percent change in the species of each of those groups of animals present at each location. And so for amphibians in this panel, birds in the middle, and mammals here, the darker colors indicate a greater degree of change that is turnover in species that is likely to occur in the future under the assumptions of one of those climate change scenarios. You'll note that it can be higher than 100 because due to species additions and species losses, both of those count. So for example, a loss of 100 out of 200 species present and a gain of 200 species from elsewhere would result in a value of 150% here. But look at the distribution of where the darkest colors are. Remember that climate change in terms of the temperature effects alone is going to be highest at high latitudes and lowest at low latitudes in the tropics here. But that's not at all where all of the most severe effects are going to be felt in terms of the change in these biological communities. Instead, what we find, we do find high change here in the at high latitudes, but we also find changes that are really profound in Mexico and Central America and in much of South America. If we were also looking at this for Africa, we'd find exactly the same pattern on all continents, and this is something that we weren't expecting. The greatest changes are in the Arctic here, of course, but also Mexico, Central America, and especially the Andes. Now, why is that? In fact, the overall changes are greater in the tropics than at mid-latitudes and high latitudes. And here I want to talk about this, what's not shown here. These are showing the percentage changes, but it's not showing the total number of species affected. If we were to look at a map not of percent change, but at the number of species affected, it would actually be far greater in the tropics than it is at mid-latitudes or high latitudes. And the reason for that is that we have far more species in the tropics than we do in the temperate zone or at high latitudes. And so the biological consequences of climate change for biological communities are actually going to be greatest in the tropics, where the degrees of warming is actually lowest, something that's counterproductive, and the first, really the first couple of decades of climate change research sort of ignored. And I want to talk about where that comes from, because it's counterintuitive. I hope that it seems counterintuitive to you as it did to most of us as well. This is from a different paper, and it just shows the percentage of mammalian species that are projected to be unable to keep pace with climate change through their natural dispersal mechanisms. This won't surprise you from what we talked about before, but you can see it's really high here in parts of the tropics. A lot of species here are likely to be unable to keep pace and change their geographic range with the with their natural dispersal abilities, even though the amount of climate change in terms of temperature is going to be less here than at higher latitudes.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, this a technical question here. We've had a couple of comments from folks that your slide is, in terms of the dimensions, is larger than what is presented on people's screens.
Oh.
And so is there a way that you could change that, either by reducing the size just a tad, so that the very top and the very bottom come into view?
Hold on just a second. I have to, my short answer is I don't know how to change that as it will show for you, but you guys might be able to do that. Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry. Just working from home, of course. I don't know how to change the dimensions of that. Yeah, I apologize. I'm not sure whether I have control of what's showing to for all of you without changing the aspect ratio. But this is a fairly standard aspect ratio.
I think if you do speaker view, it will help.
If I do what?
If the individual on the screen puts speaker view, then it makes it look better.
Oh yeah, sure. That should work.
So could you share how to accomplish that? Whoever said that?
So I'm in speaker view. This is Kim, but it still cuts off the top of his slide and the bottom of his slide. And I'm not sure why that is either, or how to fix that. Because it's a PowerPoint projection issue on his end, not ours. In terms of putting it in presenter view for folks who are not in presenter view, if you go to the top right of your Zoom screen, you see a little box that says gallery view or speaker view. If you click on speaker view, it allows you to see just the person speaking in the slide larger on your screen. And it's just, yeah, good point. It's just text. So, and you know, Greg is addressing the text, so I think you can move on. It's okay.
Okay. Yeah, I've got the same aspect ratio that I did last week, and so I'm not sure why it's different. Anyway, let's move on. So this is like I said, this is the percentage of mammalian species that are projected to be unable to keep pace with climate change, and it's a pretty high percentage. But again, it's high in the tropics, which we wouldn't expect just based on the increase in temperature there, which is lower than the increase in temperature at high latitudes. This one is from that same paper, and this is the degree to which human land use may further impede the movement of species attempting to track climate change with changes in their own geographic distributions. And so human land use, what we're talking about is mostly habitat fragmentation and conversion to agriculture and so forth. Here, the red areas are places that are highly vulnerable regions due to the inability of mammals to keep pace with climate change, but have relatively intact natural landscapes. The blue areas are where species dispersal abilities are likely to be adequate to keep up with the rate of climate change, at least given the current land use patterns without further deforestation and fragmentation and so forth. The pink areas in this graph are areas where high percentages of species are going to be unable to keep pace with climate change, and from which dispersers from those areas will encounter human-dominated landscapes. So again, we see that the tropics are likely to see some of the most profound biological consequences of climate change, even though the temperature is going to increase less there than toward the poles. So the magnitude of climate change is going to be greatest at high latitudes, but the effects on biological communities and on biological diversity are going to be greatest at low latitudes. How can that be? Well, the short answer is that the tropics have lots more species than the mid-latitudes or polar regions, but that kind of begs the question of the underlying mechanism. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time on it because first, that pattern constitutes one of biology's big questions. I mean, all of biology's big questions. Why are there so many species in the tropics? And the second reason why I want to spend a little time on it is that I'm a tropical ecologist and I think it's really cool and important. So it's largely because of that high biological diversity. Let me show you some data on things. Lots of people know a fair bit of this, but it really is profound. These are just latitudinal gradients of bird species richness, the number of species at different latitudes, even within North America and part of Mesoamerica here. And this is birds and mammals. The number of breeding bird species is really low when you get up into Alaska, of course, and it increases as you go down through the United States and especially get into tropical America. When you get down into Central America, a country like Costa Rica, and I'll show these data in a couple of minutes, has about as many species as all of North America. And we see that pattern every place we go in the world. We can go to Africa and compare it with Europe. We can go to Asia across any latitudinal gradient. And we find this pattern of increasing bird and mammal species. It's also true for plants, for insects, and for virtually everything else. It's one of those things that scientists and naturalists have noted for hundreds and hundreds of years and has been one of the central questions in all of biology. Here's one that I like to show pretty often because it highlights groups of organisms that are well known in two areas that are well known biologically, Michigan and Costa Rica. And this is just going to show the diversity of terrestrial vertebrates in Costa Rica versus Michigan. So we'll just go through these quickly here. Costa Rica has 3 species of caecilians. I'm betting that most of you have never seen a caecilian, but caecilians are amphibians. They're sort of worm or snake-like, but of course they're not reptiles, and all of them are in the tropics. So Costa Rica has 3 species of them. Even if you go to Costa Rica, you're unlikely to see them. I've only seen them a few times over all these years. But sorry about the dog barking in the background. But they live underground for the most part, so you just don't encounter them. But again, 26 species of salamanders versus 5 in Michigan, 119 frogs and toads versus 11. We go to the reptiles, 14 versus 9 for turtles, 68 versus 1 for lizards, snakes, 127 versus 12. Crocodilians, of course, we don't have any here in Michigan, but there are 2 species in Costa Rica. All the mammals together 203 species in Costa Rica versus 64 in Michigan, and 820 species of birds versus 325, despite the fact that Michigan is 3 times the size of Costa Rica. And so if we made that comparison between the temperate zone and the tropics for virtually any group of organisms, we find the same pattern: plants, insects, everything, fungi, everything else. In fact, our best estimates are that about half of all terrestrial species in the world are native to tropical forests, even though those forests only account for about 7% of land area. But what generates that pattern in the first place? And again, I'm talking about this mostly in the context of why the tropics are going to be more severely impacted by climate change than the temperate zone or polar regions. A clue to the answer lies here. You can see there's a recurring pattern across virtually all groups. This is from a 1989 paper that actually addressed this pattern that people have noticed for a long time. As you go, for these 4 groups for which data are shown here, as you go farther away from the equator, and toward the pole, you find that species have a greater latitudinal range. So for North American trees here, for example, and so the latitudinal range is just the degrees of latitude that a species' geographic range covers. And so the species that are farther north have a greater latitudinal range. And that latitudinal range is also is a proxy for geographic range. And so it holds for all of these. So you find that for North America trees. If you go to North American coastal fishes, you find basically the same pattern. Those that are found towards the poles occur over a much larger geographic area than those that occur at lower latitudes. We find it again for North American reptiles and amphibians. We find it for North American marine mollusks, so the kinds of snails and clams and sorts of things that live in the oceans adjacent to North America and so forth. We find this again and again and again. So the area that I work in the mountains of Costa Rica has hundreds of species of trees and shrubs, but there's almost no overlap in the species present at 1,600 meters elevation and those at 1,200 meters elevation, which is just a few kilometers away as the crow flies. So this pattern of small geographic ranges in the tropics relative to large compared with large geographic ranges in the temperate zone and the and polar regions is repeated again and again and again. That also sort of begs the question of why. What is it that drives that? The answer is that tropical species are more highly specialized in their physiological tolerances of temperature, rainfall, and other conditions, that is climate, than are temperate zone species or polar species. And the reason for that probably is that those organisms that live farther away from the equator have to face greater seasonal variation. Exactly what we were talking about last week. We have higher seasonal variation in temperature in particular, but also in rainfall. The farther you go away from the equator. So tropical organisms don't have to deal with the winter that we have here in Michigan or farther north. If you're going to live in the temperate zone or near the polar regions, you have to be physiologically adapted for the conditions over that entire seasonal pattern, which is really profound, unless you're able to migrate away or become dormant for part of the year. And there are organisms that do that. But if you're living in the tropics, you don't have to deal with that great degree of seasonal variation. And so organisms are more specialized on a narrow range of physical conditions. And that's why they have small geographic ranges. For that reason, we get more species packed into the tropics than we do. And that's really the best, it's the best explanation for this pattern of tropical versus temperate, or the latitudinal gradient, if you will, in species diversity. So,
Hey, Greg.
yeah, go ahead.
There's a question from Peg Van Grau that you may have answered, actually. And it was the prehistoric disparity of species similar to what has been true in more recent history?
Yeah, we do have a good handle on the historical patterns of diversity, and biological diversity has always been higher in the tropics than it is in the temperate zone. Now, there are some really interesting things about interpreting that, because as you know, the continents have moved around. And so the places that we collect fossils from and have an idea about what patterns of diversity were in the past, those places that we're digging up the fossils, some of them used to be in the tropics and they're not now. So for example, if you look at fossil organisms in Antarctica, you'll find a lot of tropical stuff because Antarctica used to be in the tropics. So it's an interesting thing to try to interpret. And still, it's an active area of research. I mean, one of the more detailed questions is, are the tropics just places where a lot of, where species survive longer, and therefore, you know, I mean, new species are arising evolutionarily all the time, and their species are going extinct all the time. But are the tropics a place that's like a museum of the evolutionary process, where they survive longer than they do at higher latitudes? Or are the tropics the cradle of diversity? Is speciation rate faster there? And the truth is, it seems to be both. There's a fair bit of research on this, but yeah, the tropics have always been centers of high diversity, and probably for reasons that I've been talking about here. As I think I mentioned before, we also see a lot of altitudinal range changes as well, particularly in the tropics. This is the area that I've spent most of my professional life working in the mountains of Costa Rica. It's called a cloud forest because it's in the mountains and it's cooler than in the lowlands. And although total rainfall is less there than in the lowlands, the fact is that it's usually enveloped in mist and clouds. So effectively, it's wetter than a lowland rainforest. It still gets plenty of rain, about 2.5 meters of rain per year, but that's lower than if you went into the lowlands. But the fact is that the very first well-documented biological effects of climate change on species distributions were documented right here, where I've been working since 1980, not by me, but by friends of ours. And this is probably the best known, biologically, the best known mid-elevation tropical forest in the world by biologists. It's located right up here in northwest Costa Rica, and if you know Costa Rica or Central America, you know that there's a chain of volcanoes that sort of goes down the spine of Central America. And of course, down to sea level here, and down to sea level here, and then up to the continental divide. That, depending on where you're at, it runs at about anywhere from about 1,500 to over 3,000 meters elevation. In the Monteverde region, the continental divide is at about 1,600 meters, and that's right where I've spent a lot of time working. Back in the 1980s, we started to notice a lot of changes in organisms that occur there. So now I want to talk about some of these altitudinal effects. And it just so happens that a bunch of us were doing our dissertation work there in the early 1980s, and some of us have kept working there. But by the late 1980s, we started to notice a lot of changes in species. This is the iconic golden toad. I don't know whether you've heard of this, but this is an endemic species that occurred only there in just a very small area of the reserve in which I work, and it went extinct in the late 1980s. It's found nowhere else in the world. I've held these things in my hand and I used to see them on a daily basis. They went extinct. A bunch of other reptile and amphibian species started to decline precipitously at that time too. This is a cloud forest anole that used to be common and now is very rare. The harlequin frog is extinct from that area, or harlequin toad rather, is extinct from that area, and lots of other places in tropical mountains too. Organisms that fed on some of these, like some of the snakes that are actually specialists to feed on frogs, they declined precipitously along with the frogs. And at the same time, we started to see a bunch of more mobile organisms like keel-billed toucans that used to be only found, that you'd find them only up to maybe 11 or 1,200 meters elevation. They started moving up to 1,500 meters by the late 1980s, and that has continued to change. So we've seen a lot of these changes in tropical mountains, and those have had pretty profound consequences in a lot of ways. And what I want to talk about now is just an example of a couple of different birds, but this has actually been studied really well. We have a pretty good handle on what these patterns are. And at the same time, climatologists have been studying the impacts of climate change, global warming in particular, on the distribution of moisture on tropical mountains, in these cloud forests in particular. They were doing research at the very same time that people were studying the distributions of birds in the Monteverde area. And they predicted that these climatic zones would be moving up in elevation, that the cloud bank would be moving up in elevation under the predicted climate change that we were expecting and in fact seeing by that time. And they predicted that that a lot of animal species that were able to move up in elevation to stay within the conditions that they're adapted for would have to move, and that those that occurred at the top of the mountain already wouldn't have any place to go. So here's just a couple of examples. This has happened in a bunch of cases. This represents a pattern, and the next couple of pictures I'll show too, represents a pattern that we see again and again on mountains, where we have two closely related species that differ in their altitudinal ranges. So they're in the same geographic range, but this is the common bush tanager, and you typically would find this, at 1,500 meters or below. But if you go up higher on the mountain, you'd find that it was replaced by sooty-capped bush tanager, a very closely related species, but they were segregated altitudinally because they compete with one another. And this one is a better competitor at high elevation. This one is a better competitor at low elevation. We find this in a bunch of different thrushes. We find it in hummingbirds. We find it in a whole bunch of different birds. Well, by about the 1990s, we were starting to see this sort of a thing where the altitudinal range of common bush tanagers was moving up, and the altitudinal range of sooty-capped bush tanagers moved up, but these have become rare, very rare, and I only ever see these at the very highest elevations in Monteverde because they've essentially been driven away by their lack of ability to deal with the changed physiological, or their physiology is not able to deal with the changing climatic conditions. and under competition with this other species of bush tanager. So we've just about lost sooty cap bush tanagers, not from the world, but from this region that they used to be common in when you went to those elevations. Same thing is true with this pair. These are redstarts, some slate-throated redstarts at lower elevations, replaced by collared redstarts at higher elevations. Nowadays, I have to go to really, really high elevations to see collared redstarts. The places where I never saw slate-throated redstarts before, now is that's the common redstart that I find there. And I don't find the collared redstarts in places that I used to. I have to go to the very top, and they're becoming rare there too. And eventually, these will become locally extinct, and these will become locally extinct. And we've seen that in a whole bunch of different birds there. People have seen this in other places too. This is actually from a more recent paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And I don't want to talk about a lot of detail here, but this is actually in the Andes, and in a location that's been well studied over time. And the range shift, so each of these is a particular species that's been well studied. And so species that have moved down in elevation will be below this zero line. Species that have moved up over time are shown above it. And you can see there's a preponderance of upward shifts in elevational range rather than downward ones. And so that's shown here as well. There have been more upward shifts than there have been downward shifts. And so we're seeing that again and again. And these are mobile species, these are birds, right? But things like reptiles and amphibians and plants can't move as fast in response to these changes in physical conditions. So we're seeing that again and again and again on tropical mountains. Again, something that shows that we wouldn't see as much of that here in the temperate zone because the organisms that live here have to be adapted for greater seasonal variation. These tropical organisms are not adapted well for seasonal variation, and so they have to move rather than tolerate it. So that kind of finishes what I wanted to say about these tropical versus temperate comparisons. And those are really intriguing because, as I said, they're counterintuitive. But this is a good place to stop in case people have questions about that part of it before I move on to some different biological consequences. Kim, are there any questions?
No, I don't see any on the chat, Greg.
Okay, so I'll go ahead then and talk about another type of biological effect of climate change, and that is on phenology. Phenology is just a word that we use for the timing of important, not impotent, but important biological effects like spring leaf emergence and plant dormancy in the fall, breeding seasons of animals and stuff like that, the timing of these things. We would expect those to be changing too. And in fact, these effects, responses to climate change have been noted for a lot of animal and plant species for many years now. And I just want to touch on a couple of those things. Here's just a data set from the earliest appearance of all UK butterfly species. Now, they collect these data from the dates at which they start to see the emerged butterflies that start flying around looking for mates. And so the dates at which that has occurred, so this is the day of the year, the dates at which that occurred has been getting earlier and earlier because it's warmer and the precipitation patterns have been changing under climate change. So the spring, if you will, for UK butterfly species has been coming earlier and earlier. On average, species have been appearing 5 days earlier in the spring per decade over the period of time that's been followed. what we're looking at here is the mean flowering date of a bunch of plant species versus spring temperature at Walden Pond. And some of these data were actually collected by Henry David Thoreau, who you'll remember from his time on Walden Pond. And so as spring temperature increases, we find that the first flowering date of a lot of plants has gotten earlier. And so again, spring is coming earlier, and we sort of know that from our region as well. Both plants and animals are responding to those things, but not necessarily in the same way across different species. And I'll come to that now. I just want to sort of point out that all species don't respond phenologically to a changing climate in the same way. And when species that have important ecological interactions with one another respond differently, the mismatches in timing can be really disruptive. This just sort of represents that scenario for an insectivorous bird, for example. In many birds, for example, breeding seasons are timed such that the chicks will hatch at about the same time that the maximum food resources occur in that region. And for a lot of birds that feed their offspring insects, they're timing their breeding seasons not to coincide, not for the egg laying period to coincide with maximum insect availability, but laying the eggs early enough so that the chicks will be in the nest, because that's when the highest energetic demands are for the parents. And so that's a match that responds evolutionarily, and it's a little bit different in different regions where the spring comes earlier versus later and so forth. But if the response of the birds and their breeding season is not the same, their response to climate change is not the same as what drives insects, then there can be a mismatch. So for example, and this is one of the reasons why I use birds for this, in a lot of cases, birds' breeding seasons are timed not so much to temperature and rainfall patterns directly, but they use photoperiod. That is the changing length of the day and the night. And temperature and rainfall have minor influences on the timing of breeding, coming into breeding conditions and laying eggs and stuff like that. But insects are more, in the plants that they're feeding on, do have important influences of temperature and rainfall. And so what we've seen in a lot of cases is a shift of earlier availability and the peak availability of bird food, but the birds are still breeding at the same time. And so by the time the chicks come around, the availability of insect food for the offspring has gone down. And so that can read that sort of a mismatch in the timing can lead to widespread breeding failure in birds. And we've seen examples of that and expect to see more. That sort of brings up the idea that interactions are really important. And even though I haven't talked about interactions very much, when we were talking about changes in geographic distributions of species in response to climate change and these altitudinal changes and so forth, it's not just the species themselves that are important, the interactions between them are important. And because species respond differently to climate change, we're not going to see a shift of whole biological communities intact, like the beech maple forest or the oak hickory forest. Those species are not all going to move at the same rate. They're going to respond individualistically. We know this. And so different species are going to respond differently, and we're going to create entirely new communities of organisms, some of which will be lacking the important pollinators or seed dispersers or other mutualists that they have co-evolved with. And so we'll probably lose those if they don't, if they're not moving with the important species that they interact with. This is an area that's really, really poorly understood because biological communities are really complex and have lots and lots of different pathways of interaction. And we just don't have the ability to predict what the consequences of those missing interactions are going to be. This is one of the things that's going to drive the cascading of extinctions that we see, but we just don't have a really good understanding of the extent to which that's going to happen, but we do know that it is going to happen. Well, there's even a local thing here. I don't know how many of you might remember my take in the paper that Graham Peasley published. He was a faculty member in our chemistry department. But with help from some others of us in the sciences, he published a My Take on the 2nd of May, 2010. And as far as I know, this is the only editorial in the, or at least letter to the editor of the Holland Sentinel that ever had a graph in it. So we were really proud of that. But what he did was he started looking at the date of the Tulip Festival over a period of time from 1930 to 2010 when this was published. And you can see it's been shifted earlier and earlier in the year. And again, this is this day of the year. And the reason, of course, is that nobody likes to have a STEM festival. They've had to shift the timing of tulip time to coincide with the flowering season of tulips, which has been getting earlier because of climate change. So anyway, there's a local connection there that's really interesting. I want to say just a little bit about climate change effects on individual organisms, because we've been talking about population and community level consequences as being driven by the match between climatic conditions and physiological adaptations of organisms. So I wanted to say just a little bit about those, especially with respect to temperature. You probably know that metabolic rate is the result, or metabolism is just biochemical reactions, and so I think we mentioned last time that like anything else, the rates of those chemical reactions that constitute metabolism are temperature dependent, and so we do have in animals some different ways of dealing with that, depending on whether they maintain a constant body temperature or allow their body temperature to mirror that of the environment. Organisms like reptiles and amphibians and fish and insects, and in fact plants, don't regulate their body temperature very differently than what the external environment is. And so as temperature increases, their metabolic rate goes up, and therefore their food consumption, their necessity for energy goes up. Things work a little bit different. We call those ectotherms, but you can really sort of think of those as the things you probably learned as cold-blooded, but they're not necessarily cold-blooded. If they live in a warm environment, their bodies will be warm. But we contrast those usually with things that you probably learned as warm-blooded, birds and mammals, for example, but we better term those endotherms because they regulate their body temperature usually higher than the external environment. And in them, the metabolic rate actually has a more complex relationship with temperature. If you look at metabolic rate versus ambient temperature in a typical ectotherm, it goes up, and therefore the oxygen consumption rate, that's a measure of metabolic rate, it goes up with temperature. And so we expect under scenario of climate change that ectotherms are going to require more energy. If we compare that to endotherms, endotherms have this kind of a relationship. You might remember this from general biology, where as it gets colder and colder, an endotherm actually has higher metabolic rate because they're using more energy to stay warm, that is to maintain a constant body temperature. At some range though, which we call the thermal neutral zone, the metabolic rate doesn't change very much with an increase in temperature. With an increase in temperature, and that's because the organism can maintain the body temperature by just changing the orientation of its fur or feathers, or changing its orientation relative to the sun, and so forth. At some point, though, temperature gets high enough that the organism, and again, this with birds, mammals, including people, the temperature gets high enough that they have to start expending more energy to stay cool via sweating more, via panting, stuff like that. But most organisms, most endotherms occur, we live with body temperatures that are pretty close to our critical temperatures. We can't increase our body temperatures very much before we physiologically have a lot of problems and then of course die. I just want to point this out, talk about temperature differences for ectotherms in particular. These are just some data for daily temperatures experienced by tree lizards of a particular species in southeastern Arizona. And the black line here is actually for in the sun. And so this is time of day, and obviously during the hot part of the day, the operative temperature that they experience is really high. I mean, body temperature for humans is about 37 degrees Celsius. And so in the sun, these organisms are actually above their upper critical temperature. So they have to be able to stay in the shade in order, they have to be able to move between sun and shade to maintain a body temperature that's close to their preferred temperature. And of course, as it gets hotter, it's harder to find habitats in which they can stay in the cooler microhabitats, that is in the shade, at times of day when the air temperature is higher. And this is really important for a lot of species that live in hotter areas. The last one of these pictures I want to show is this one, and this is just survival probability in a typical insect ectotherm, the fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster. And so at different operating temperatures for different amounts of time, this is the survival probability. And you can see even ectotherms here are actually living in conditions where their survival probability drops really rapidly with a small increase in ambient temperature. And so both ectotherms and endotherms are often living at pretty close to critical temperatures for their survival. And so that's one of the individual level physiological responses that drives these larger population and community patterns that we've been talking about. Okay, now I want to break from individuals and sort of going back to talking about species distributions and stuff like that, and make another connection to climate change that isn't a direct one, but is an indirect one. Another major determinant of patterns of biological diversity is natural disturbance. Natural disturbance is of a variety of sorts, but two that I want to sort of highlight here are things like wildfire and storm damage. But physical disturbance is really important. We used to think of events like storms and fires and other kinds of physical disturbance as aberrations to be avoided. So we try to suppress fire. We think of storms as a bad thing and so forth. But since the 1980s, we've really come to understand that physical disturbance is a natural and necessary part of all biological communities, and that every biological community is actually somewhere in the process of recovery from the last major disturbance. There are other minor disturbances like individual trees falling over, being knocked down by wind and stuff. And in fact, that's something that I study intensively. But major disturbances are actually much more under the control of or influenced by climate change. And of course, different species of plants and animals are adapted to thrive in the physical and biological conditions at different phases of recovery from the last major disturbance. The early stages are dominated by weedy species that have good dispersal ability and rapid growth, and so they get there first. But they tend not to be very good competitors as a forest reestablishes, and so they get crowded out later as the dominant species of the forest reestablish. These are not from around here. This is actually a coniferous forest, and this is hurricane damage from a recent hurricane in the southeastern United States. But around here, think of things like sassafras and sumac as species that dominate the early stages of ecological succession after a disturbance. And that could be human disturbance as well. I mean, if clear cutting a forest, the same process goes on as recovery after a wildfire or a storm. But ultimately, things like sassafras and sumac get crowded out as the dominant species of sugar maple and American beech and some of the others get reestablished and are better competitors under the conditions that obtain long after a disturbance. If we think about why that's important in the context of climate change, as the frequency and intensity of physical disturbance from things like storms and fires increase, we expect to see greater domination of natural areas by those early successional weedy species, because natural landscapes won't have a chance to recover before the next disturbance comes along. That idea is kind of embodied in this graph. It's an ecological principle that we call the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And if you think just about the level or frequency of disturbance along the x-axis here, and species richness, that is the number of species present in a community, being on the y-axis. If we have really low disturbance, we have low diversity because we're missing the early successional species that have gotten crowded out by the dominants like beech and maple. If we have really high levels of disturbance, we have low species richness because we've lost most of the dominant species. They don't have a chance to reestablish and come to dominate the community before the next disturbance, the next storm or fire comes along. It's at these intermediate levels of disturbance where species diversity is high, because we retain both the early successional weedy species and the dominant species. And if we have higher disturbance rates as a result of climate change, and we know now that storm frequency and intensity of tropical storms in particular, but flooding is another natural disturbance, wildfire is another natural disturbance. Those things are all being driven to higher rates and intensities, higher frequencies and intensities by climate change. We're seeing some of those changes in biological communities as a result of that. Similarly, when we suppress things like wildfire, when we put out all of the fires, we actually lose some of the early successional species too. That's one of the reasons why we use prescribed fire now to manage communities, because a lot of plants and whole communities are adapted to that natural disturbance regime. But climate change is having an effect there as well. So I want to talk about some little things too, and I'm getting sort of toward talking about some effects on human systems as well. But I want to touch on some other things that are biological consequences of climate change we haven't talked about yet. We've talked about a lot of feedbacks in the climate system, and there are both negative and positive feedbacks. Negative feedbacks in the climate system, of course, as we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of course, we actually have increased rates of plant growth, and that removes carbon from the atmosphere. That's a negative feedback. But there are positive feedbacks there too, and these are ones that are really concerning. One that's sort of shown here is the change in albedo of the planetary system as glaciers and polar ice and sea ice melts. Albedo is essentially a measure of the amount of reflectivity of the sun's solar radiation from the Earth. And of course, because ice and snow are really reflective, about 85% of sunlight that impinges on them gets reflected back towards space. But open water and land has a much different albedo. It actually absorbs a lot more of that energy that comes from the sun, and less of it is reflected back into space. And so as we increase the temperature of the planet and start to lose more and more of our glacial cover and polar ice caps and sea ice, more of the sun's energy is absorbed and stays in the Earth rather than getting reflected back into space. So that's a positive feedback mechanism. Another one that you've probably heard about involves permafrost. Now, permafrost in high latitude systems ends up sequestering a lot of carbon. So we have vegetation growing, on the surface, and then as that biomass dies and starts to decay under really cold conditions, a bunch of it doesn't have a chance to decay fully, and it ends up in the permafrost. And so that's carbon. I mean, remember the carbon cycle here. Most biomass, including most of our bodies, are made up of carbon, essentially. And so it's carbon that originally is taken out of the atmosphere by plants, and then it's consumed by animals and so forth. But as those things die, if they don't decompose right away, that carbon doesn't get returned into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and then being available to go back into the plants as part of that cycle. Instead, it gets sequestered in a non-atmospheric form in the permafrost. Remember too that all of our fossil fuels, all of the coal, all of the petroleum was once, all of that carbon, which is the primary constituent of it, all that carbon used to be in the atmosphere. It was removed by organisms and put into a non-gaseous form over a long period of time. That's why we call them fossil fuels. But it's all the result of biological activity. Well, of course, as we increase the temperature of the planet, that active layer of soil where decomposition is taking place goes deeper and deeper. In other words, it melts the permafrost. And all of that organic material that was once sequestered in frozen soils becomes available now. It thaws and decays, and actually CO2 and methane that are emitted from it go back into the atmosphere. It turns out that the upper 3 meters of northern permafrost zone soils contain an equal amount of carbon to about 50% of the soil carbon found in ecosystems everywhere else in the whole world, even though that region of the world comprises only about 15% of the total area in which soil occurs. So there's a lot of carbon and methane, for that matter, locked up in the permafrost. And so this is another positive feedback mechanism. Global warming driving more melting of the permafrost, that puts even more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, leading to increased global warming. These positive feedback mechanisms create a lot of instability and are one of the major causes for concern too. But there's a biological component here as well, in this one in particular, because it's microbial action that doesn't melt the permafrost, but liberates the carbon tied up into it and puts it back in the atmosphere.
Hey, Greg, we've got a question on
Yeah,
chat.
go ahead.
This is from Tom and Milt Reddick. What would the consequence of massive melting of frozen methane in continental shelves, gigatons more, in the Arctic? Is this a devastating feedback loop?
Yes, it is. And it turns out that it's not just permafrost. There's a lot of methane in parts of the ocean that's tied up as methane hydrates, I think it is. And those are temperature dependent too. And methane has about 86 times the effect as effective as CO2 as in terms of global warming, its ability to trap heat. Maybe we'll talk about that if we have a chance at the end. But putting methane into the atmosphere is actually a lot worse than putting carbon dioxide into it. And we're doing that as well. It's another major greenhouse gas. Even though we're not putting as much methane into the atmosphere, pound for pound, the methane that we put into the atmosphere has a much greater effect than carbon dioxide on forcing climate to become warmer. So yeah, the liberation of methane from the ocean or from the land has a huge effect, and it's a positive feedback mechanism, absolutely. I want to talk about some quick examples of effects on human public health and economics, because that's biological too in the broad sense. But I just want to touch on some of these because they're sort of beyond the scope of, I mean, we could spend weeks and weeks on any of these. One is just recall that it's not just average temperature that's going to increase. It's the we already have variation in temperature. We have hot days, we have cool days, and of course the extremes are going to become more frequent if we increase the overall temperature. So these are just projected increases in days in the United States that are 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And these are under a couple of different climate change scenarios, one that is more severe and one that is less. Again, these are based on how fast we decrease weather and how fast we decrease our carbon emissions. And so you can see by the end of the century, we're having a lot greater increase in, we're going to see a lot of increase in the degree of, or the number of those really high temperature days over the year. Of course, that's going to have consequences for all sorts of things because we have to use energy to cool our built environment and stuff like that. These are just projected changes in average temperature for the Great Lakes region from a period of about 2041 to 2070, and this is under one of the scenarios in which we don't do very much to control our carbon emissions. And so what you can see here in the Great Lakes region, we're expecting temperature increases of about 3.5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit projected by that period of time, which is not too far away as compared to the 1971 to 2000 baseline that's used for this particular graph. Again, assuming emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise. In our area, the prediction is for about 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. if we looked at differently the number of cooling degree days that we're expecting in our region, we're expecting an increase in those cooling degree days. Cooling degree days isn't, oh, sorry, that's average temperature again. Wait a minute. Yeah, cooling degree days is shown here. And this is just, again, projected for a comparison to the 1971 to 2000 period by 2070 to 2099, so toward the end of this century. Cooling degree days are not actually measured in days per se, but it's the number of degrees that a day's average temperature is above 65 degrees Fahrenheit added up over the year. And so it's used in terms of projecting the need for air conditioning, for example. And these kinds of representations of temperature over the year project for our area a great increase in the need for air conditioning, and therefore the energy that we use to cool our homes and businesses and stuff like that. Those predictions suggest a very significant increase in energy needs. Again, something that you could think of as a positive feedback loop if we're using fossil fuels primarily to generate electricity. Agricultural yields, this is a really active area of research, one that I'm not very conversant with, but it's, you know, obviously we all depend on agriculture, whether we're in the United States or elsewhere. And we are expecting production of corn, wheat, soybeans, and cotton, which are the things that are dealt with in this particular figure. We expect that to decline over much of the US by the later part of this century. The areas where the yields are projected to decline, which are the warmer colors here, are concentrated primarily in the south and the eastern, or the southwest and the eastern part of the country. And we're expecting to see agricultural yields for those products to increase in some other parts of the country. Again, we're not expecting the whole corn belt or whatever to shift into Canada, but it is going to shift, and that's going to have economic consequences as well. Just a little bit about something that should be of great concern, and I'm just going to use a couple of examples here. This is just an animation of the current and projected range of the mosquito species that carries a number of different human viruses, and in fact, it's the same one that carries malaria. It's Aedes aegypti, represented in terms of the number of months per year that species could transmit diseases in different parts of the world based on the climate at that place and time. You can see that as the climate warms, so this is just sort of shuttling between 2019, 2050, and 2080. You can see it as the climate warms, the range of the mosquito, and hence the potential range of the diseases that it is a vector for, extends farther and farther from the tropics into North America and Europe. This is primarily a tropical animal, which is why malaria has always been primarily a tropical disease. We have similar projections for the mosquito species that carry yellow fever, Zika virus, dengue fever, and other vector-borne diseases. In many cases, they're actually even worse. I would also point out that of course, as climate changes, these vectors for a lot of human diseases are not only projected to and actually observed now to be moving farther north and south out of the tropics, they're also moving up in elevation. And that's a real concern for people in the tropics who live at high elevation. Like I said, I work at relatively high elevation in the tropics, and in fact, a large portion of the human population in tropical regions lives at high elevations. Think of Quito, Ecuador, or Bogota, Colombia, which are about 8 or 9,000 feet elevation respectively. They don't have any of the tropical diseases there. And these are, major population centers. And part of the reason why those large population centers developed in the first place was to escape from the tropical diseases in the lowlands. The mosquitoes are moving up in elevation along with the climate zones that they're adapted to. And people at some of these higher elevation places are starting to be subjected to diseases now that they historically have been protected from. I can tell you, even from Monteverde, which is much lower, it's about 5,000 feet elevation. Most of the time that I have worked there, certainly in the early days, we never saw mosquitoes. I never used mosquito repellent or anything like that. But in the 1990s, we started getting mosquitoes up there in the forest. And one of my colleagues swears that he contracted dengue fever right up in the areas in the forest where we work there rather than in the lowlands, because he hadn't even been to the lowlands. And dengue fever is a serious disease. But we're seeing a whole bunch of those diseases move and projected to see a lot more. Just a quick reference to sea level. We talked about sea level rise a little while back, mostly last week. We're already locked into about 5 or 6 feet of sea level rise just from the carbon we've already added to the atmosphere. We're already committed to that, and in fact, we've seen sea level rise at about 0.13 inches per year, I think, or millimeters per year. I can't remember now, but anyway, we're already committed to about 5 or 6 feet of it. And around the world, including the US, a large proportion of the human population lives in coastal areas. This is a projection for human migration in the United States in response to sea level rise. We're expecting by 2100, about 13 million people in the US alone having to move away from their homes in coastal areas in response to sea level rise. Despite the fact that the US is really rich and we have the ability to build dikes, to build, to run pumps and stuff like that, to control it better than most places in the world. So the US is sort of the best case scenario. The blue on this map shows areas from which people are likely to be displaced by a 6-foot sea level rise. And the other colors on here are proportional to the areas in which people are going to move to. And so the more reddish colors are areas, and this is by county, where people are expected to move to that get displaced from coastal areas. And that's the reference for that if you want to follow up on it.
Greg?
Sorry, go ahead.
There's a question on chat or a comment from Tom and Milt Reddick. Wouldn't a worst case scenario of sea level rise go into the 20-foot range?
Yes, but perhaps not as quickly as what we're talking about here. So yeah, I mean, if you can easily do the calculations, and you can find this online. If the Greenland ice sheet entirely melted and the Antarctic ice sheet melted entirely, that would give us a much greater sea level rise, which would completely put much of the eastern U.S. and the southeastern U.S. underwater. But this is the sort of sea level rise that we're expecting, on sort of the best estimates by about 2100. But eventually, I mean, if you think about, most of us are not going to be here in 2100, but that's really not that far in the future.
No.
But sea level rise is going to continue after that, and we have to be thinking of how to adapt to it.
Great. And we've got another one from Bill Wells. Bill's question is, what are climate change impacts of air conditioning refrigerants?
CFCs, which we used to use, and I can tell you too, my dad was an air conditioning mechanic by trade and had his own business for a lot of the years while I was growing up. And so I can tell you, I've put a lot of CFCs into the atmosphere. We didn't know at that time that was, so when you had to replace the refrigerant or whatever, or you had to open up a compressor or something like that, you just bled all that to the atmosphere. We don't do that anymore because we know that chlorofluorocarbons not only decrease the ozone in our atmosphere, which is what is our major protectant against ultraviolet radiation, they also are potent greenhouse gases. We saw great increases, and in fact, they're more potent than carbon dioxide pound for pound, just like methane is. We were increasing those in the atmosphere for many years, but in recent decades, the degree to which the most harmful chlorofluorocarbons are being added to the atmosphere has decreased because we're using different refrigerants in many cases now than we were using a few decades ago. And they're less serious now than they used to be. We're also not using them as propellants in aerosol cans the way we used to prior to the 1990s. And so, refrigerants have a very definite effect on climate change, but it's less than it used to be. And in fact, the reduction in the emissions of those chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere that has taken place in the last couple of decades is one of the major success stories of international cooperation and regulation. It was countries that got together to decrease the use of chlorofluorocarbons, and the thinning of the ozone layer and the ozone hole that we used to use to talk about back in the 80s, that has largely been that effect has largely been stopped by international agreement. It's one of our major success stories of international agreement, one that we ought to be thinking now about when we talk about the Paris Climate Accords and as we go forward. So anyway, lots of people are going to be displaced here and elsewhere. We're almost out of time, and I don't want to say I'm kind of done with what I wanted to talk about with the strictly biological effects, but if people want to, if they're not already, sort of tired of listening to all this, if anybody wants to talk about how greenhouse gases affect climate, we could do that. But as far as and I'm prepared to do that, but we're just about out of time. And so maybe it's better to take questions. And if you want me to do some of this, I can touch on it. But what's your pleasure? We have other comments or questions that we should talk about before we end our time, or what? I'm at your service.
So here's a comment via chat that is in favor of you continuing.
Oh, to talk about this.
Yeah, there are several who would be in favor of you proceeding. For those who are, able to remain, people may have other things they have to do.
Okay, well, let's talk about this for a few minutes then, because it's really interesting. We know that some of these gases are greenhouse gases, but lots of us are not maybe very familiar with how that connection is made, and it's really just physics. If Don Triesenberg is in there, sorry for saying just physics, but it's physics that's well understood. The Earth's energy balance is summarized here, and I don't want to go into any of this detail, but you can think of the Earth's temperature as being a balance between the amount of energy that comes into the Earth, and that is only via the sun, and the energy that's leaving the Earth, and that's via radiation back out into space. The difference between the amount of energy that comes in and leaves the planetary system is what determines its temperature. And so that's kind of summarized here, and I don't want to go into those details, but suffice it to say that the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere act a little bit like the glass in your car's windshield and rear window. The car heats up when the sun is out because the glass is transparent to the visible wavelengths of light coming from the sun, which is a good thing. That's why we use glass as glass to see through. But that same glass is opaque to the infrared radiation being emitted by the car interior as it heats up. And so it gets trapped inside the car and everything inside the car heats up. It's the same principle as with greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. This is just a graphical summary of the output of the output of energy from the sun. And as you probably, if you ever had a physics class and talked about the physics of heat transfer, you know that the wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that are emitted by an object is largely a function of the temperature of the object. Well, our sun is about 57, 78 degrees Kelvin. And so its emission spectrum smoothed out looks something like this. And it has a peak in its emissions in the visible part of the spectrum. It's really, it's mostly in the green. If you were to go into space and look at our sun, it would look green rather than yellow. But this is what the spectrum of emissions from the sun is, because it's really hot. Now, the Earth receives that radiation because our atmosphere is largely transparent to most of this wavelength range. That heats up the Earth. And of course, the Earth radiates energy back into back into outer space, but it does so not at this part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but at much longer wavelengths. In fact, in the thermal infrared part of the spectrum. And so, that's the heat exchange between the Earth and space. And these longer wavelengths are actually absorbed by some of the gases in our atmosphere very effectively. Sorry. I'm going to skip down from here. Oh, shoot, I don't have that other figure. Well, anyway, let me go back and just talk about this here. Things like water vapor, chlorofluorocarbons, methane, and a couple of other compounds absorb the radiation at these wavelengths very strongly. In other words, they act like the glass in your car. So we've got visible wavelengths coming in, but the infrared wavelengths going back out get trapped by some of the gases. That's a lucky thing for us. If we didn't have those kinds of gases on our planet, at night it would get as cold as some of the other planets in our solar system, and this wouldn't be a habitable planet. The greenhouse effect is a good thing. It makes our planet habitable to us. But as we increase the concentrations of some of those gases in the atmosphere, we're increasing the Earth's temperature because more of it gets trapped here and not re-radiated into space. And the ones that we're most concerned about here are carbon dioxide, because that's the one we're changing the most, but also methane, because we're increasing the amount of methane too. And here's a place where I'll make a connection to energy policy as well, if you want me to go on. Okay, just a brief word about natural gas. This is something that I talked about a little bit the other night. If you generate electricity with an efficient gas-fired plant, it's true, it emits 50 to 60% less CO2 than with a coal-fired plant. And that's a great thing. And that's the rationale by which we built a new natural gas-fired plant rather than a new coal-fired plant here in Holland. But it turns out that a bunch of that natural gas, which is mostly methane, a bunch of it leaks into the atmosphere during the extraction and transportation process. Most studies suggest that it's somewhere between 1% and 9% of the total extracted natural gas leaks into the atmosphere. And because methane is about 86 times as potent as CO2 as a greenhouse gas at trapping heat over a timeline of about 20 years, that leakage is really, really important. And so for the lowered CO2 emissions from burning natural gas to generate electricity, to offset the increased warming potential from the leaked methane during the extraction and transportation process, people have estimated that the methane losses are going to need to be kept below 3.2%. And in many cases, they're probably higher than that right now. So this is an active area of research. We really need to understand this better than we do currently. There is, as you might imagine, a controversy between the natural gas industry, which maintains that it's a really small amount of loss, and some other people who've studied it that have found that there are much higher rates of loss. But when you go out with an infrared imaging camera that can see methane where your naked eye cannot, here's an IR image of methane at the top here, the loss of methane from a processing facility. Here's another one from a storage facility here lower at a fracking facility in Texas. And you can see there's a fair bit of methane leaking into the atmosphere, and that's a potent greenhouse gas. We do know that methane concentration is increasing in the atmosphere. Now it's increasing for other reasons too. Methane is also emitted by melting permafrost. It's belched by cattle and other ruminants that don't break down their food as efficiently as some other organisms. Rice cultivation puts a lot of methane into the atmosphere and so forth. So there are a lot of sources of it, but one of them that we do have control over is the amount that's leaking from fracking facilities and transportation in particular. Something that we need to study better and get a handle on, but it's controversial because industries don't like to be regulated. This is a good place to just kind of finish up, and I'll give you a list of good starting places for scientific information on climate change. There's lots of misinformation out there too, of course, but the Union of Concerned Scientists is a really good one. Climate Change Central is a really good one. Here for the Great Lakes region, GLESA is a good one. NASA and NOAA, of course, are good sources of information, although some of their information has been either taken down or is not being updated now for the last 3.5 years or so. Maybe that'll change in the future and they'll get back on track, but they're still really good sources of information. And this sixth one, Skeptical Science, is a really good source of information too. It's another nonprofit science education organization that is particularly good at examining the claims made by climate change deniers and skeptics from the perspective of the current state of scientific knowledge. You can actually get a pretty good education about the state of major controversies by exploring that website. But there are lots and lots of resources out there. The last thing I want to say, since we're talking about the biological consequences of climate change, is to just show this. Everybody knows what this is. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you know that this is Coruscant. It's the capital city of the Galactic Empire. And even though it's not sort of shown in the Star Wars movies, in this is a vision of hell for me. It's a planet that is completely covered by human habitation, high density human habitation, with virtually no natural systems left. We're somewhere, in much of the world today, we're somewhere on the trajectory of getting like that in small areas. But one of the things I want to point out is the planetary climate system involves lots of feedbacks between physical processes and biological processes. Having something like Coruscant, it would actually be, for the most part, impossible without supporting it from stuff coming from the outside. But we don't have the ability to have stuff coming from the outside. We need to protect the natural systems upon which our own survival depends. We don't exist apart from nature and really have the option of either having it or not having it the way people on Coruscant seem to have. We really depend on it. And every aspect of life, including our own aspect of life, our own the human economy, depends absolutely on intact natural systems that regulate climate and that provide us with virtually everything we use. So anyway, that's a quick run through some of the biological consequences of climate change. And I will stop sharing there if I can figure out.
We do have two more questions, Greg.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So they're both on chat. One is from Sue Bolander. She says, I was at Hemlock Crossing on Sunday and walked in the spruce lane and it was all dead. I was there a few years ago and it was thriving. What happened? So I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I haven't been in that part of Hemlock Crossings for a while, but there are some conifer pests and diseases in our area now that are of concern. I'm not sure about the spruces, but and it's too early to have seen much mortality here from Hemlock woolly adelgids, but there are some insects and fungal diseases that are attacking some of those that may or may not be important. But I can also tell you that just our rising water levels are causing the deaths of trees in some places. Those of you who've been in Holland long enough remember, well, when I moved here in 1986, the water was high enough in our area that there was just a patch of lily pads out in the Black River just as you cross the bridge. If you're going north, crossing the bridge, if you look out from the bridge right there, there was a patch of lily pads. And as water levels declined over the years, we got a bunch of trees growing out there. Well, now water levels are high again, and all of those trees have died. So some of that in areas that are really close to the water, and some areas at Hemlock Crossing are close to the water, those trees can die just because their root systems are inundated with water. That kind of waxes and wanes. But whether that's the case in this particular case, I don't know.
Great. And then here's the final question from Louis Morel. Can Professor Murray tell us more about the local groups that he alluded to at the beginning of the presentation?
There are probably people on here that could tell you more about those, but if you look at today's Holland Sentinel, you'll see an opinion piece by Peter Bugart, who is involved with Citizens Climate Lobby. And he's probably in this call, but that's a local organization that is seeking to influence both local and national and international policy to decrease the rate of climate change via addressing especially use of fossil fuels for transportation and electricity generation. I see Peter is still here. He could say some more about that. But also, if you look at his article in today's paper, he refers to that organization, but also to the mayor's strategic design team, which has started work recently. And they're going to be looking at the community energy plan that we adopted about 10 years ago and seeing how we can augment or magnify the ways in which we're trying to address climate change here locally. So Peter, you want to say something about local organizations that people can get involved in?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I would refer you to the article too, rather than take a lot of time here talking, because I think it covers what I'd like to say. The most important thing to me is advocacy, that you lay out well the science, you lay out well the reasons why we ought to respond in some way. What we need now are the pathways by which we do respond. And Citizens Climate Lobby wants to be one of those pathways. We lobby, especially at the federal level, for fee and dividend legislation that would minimize our carbon pollution. But we also recognize it's just as important to speak here locally. We contribute in our own way to climate change with the way we live. And we can address that, but only collectively. My personal virtue only solves a small part of the problem. We need to be a united people, and united over a long period of time, administration over administration, steadily progressing towards a viable solution. So for Citizens Climate Lobby, citizensclimatelobby.org, I encourage you to click on that and join us. We intend to maintain that voice as long as it's necessary to get federal legislation moving in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I didn't say much about advocacy because that really wasn't the topic, but you know, climate change is the issue of our time. I mean, it dwarfs COVID and anything else you can imagine because it's a planetary thing. And we, you know, people formed groups like governments in the first place to address big problems. There are things that can't be addressed effectively by individual action in isolation, even though, as Peter said, we can individually do a lot, but we can't get anywhere near the solution to really big problems unless we act collectively. And that's essentially what groups of people, including governments, are for. That's why government was formed in the first place. So I would make a big plug, as Peter did, for advocacy. Understanding the nature of the issue is really important, but it's not enough just to understand it because it affects all of us and our posterity. So anyway, that's all I have to say, really.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. It's been a great presentation, very insightful and great learning opportunity, and you did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Peter, too. I appreciate all of you being